Okay, so welcome to the lectures on community ecology. So please keep in mind when we talked about population ecology, we were looking at a single population, or we could say a species, that we want to focus on and say what's happening with this species. Is the population growing? Is the population declining? Let's look at all the dynamics and variables involved with and associated with population, a single specific population. Now, as we get into community ecology, what we're looking at with community ecology is the interactions between all of the populations in a given area. So what we have to consider here with community is how all these different populations interact with each other. So you look at the fish in the picture. There's 10, 12, 15, whatever different species of fish. But what about the 20 species of coral? What about the different species of algae and the different species of invertebrates, the little worms or crustaceans? All of those things interact together, and they have connections and interactions with each other. That is what makes up a community. A community is all of the populations. It is not just one single population. So when somebody talks about their community, they should be talking about, okay, there's this many people in our community, and we have these jobs and these restaurants and these businesses, and we also have the deer and the rabbit, and if you go to the lake, you can go fishing, and yeah, there's mosquitoes in the summer. Those are all populations that are part of your community. To ignore them is ignoring the majority of the community. So with community ecology, we don't want to focus on just a single population. We look at all of them and how they all connect. So as we look at communities, and we look at a given area, you define the area. It could be 100 acres of this coral reef. It could be my 10 acres of my parents' property. It could be my backyard. It could be whatever. You define the size of the community, but then we go in and we look at all the different populations excuse me, that exist or live in that community. So what we're going to see is all the species that live there have what we call an optimum range for environmental conditions. Temperature, moisture, pH, etc. All of these things that we call the abiotic conditions. So each species has an optimal range of abiotic conditions that it can survive within. Okay, so just a simple example with the diagram here. We have the green species, and its optimum range is, let me get the pen, is kind of between here and here. And let's say we're talking about rainfall here. This is 0 inches, and this is at the far end of the spectrum. We're going to say it is 20 inches of rainfall in the course of a year. So this green species does really well when you roughly have probably about 5 inches of rain up to about 15. That is its optimal zone or optimal range, 5 to 15 inches of rain. Less rain, species doesn't do well. The population doesn't grow. It doesn't survive that well. Too much rain, species can't survive at all. It drowns out. It gets rotted out. Whatever the case may be, it won't survive. So it wants to stay in, let's call it the sweet spot, between 5 and 15. Now when we look at the community and we look at the diagram below, and we're talking about rainfall for the community, there's a bunch of different species. So what you notice, the green species has its optimum range roughly between 5 and 15. The purple species, well, that species does much better when it's drier. So if it's down here at maybe 3 inches or 2 inches of rain, and it does well up until about 5. But once you hit 5, this purple species population doesn't do so well, and it can't survive in that moderate rainfall. It does better as it gets wetter though, so once it gets into about the 15-inch rainfall, then that purple species starts to do really well and can do really well all the way up until 20 inches of rain. So if you notice, there's an overlap between the purple and the green species, but not a direct overlap. So what we see happening in every community is that every single population in the community will have evolved what we call its ecological niche. So the niche is a species, we're going to call it job, that it performs within the community. Now, what does it do? What is its role? What is its particular task? Where can it survive? What abiotic conditions can it survive under? All those things fall within the niche of that species. So the ducks, the geese, the plovers, all these birds here, if you notice, they all have a very specific ecological niche where they feed. Our plover feeds way up here on shore. The oyster catcher, a little further towards the water and even a little bit into the water's edge. The avocets, shallow water, maybe 3 inches to about 8 inches of water. The ducks, well, those guys are pretty good in 8 to probably about 12 or 14 inches of water. And then the flamingos, well, these guys, they have to be in water that's about 24 to 36 inches. So you look, they all live in the same community, but they all have a slightly different area that they feed. So their job is to feed in that specific area, and they're adapted to that. Look at the legs on these animals. Look at the way their bodies are evolved and the structure. Those guys all do well in those particular little niches. So as long as you don't overlap completely, you're gonna do pretty well with those other species in that given area. If you have complete overlap, then we get into competition. Now, competition is going to exist within every population and between populations. The key is figuring out how much competition there is. So within a population, these wolves are fighting for dominance. There's one alpha and one alpha male and one alpha female. One top wolf male, one top wolf female. Those are the ones who breed within that pack. The rest of the wolves support them. So there's always competition. Who's going to be number one in your population or in your particular wolf pack? That's just a fact of life. The greatest competition you face is always from your own kind, your own species. Individuals who are very similar to you will be your greatest competition because they need exactly the same resources. Wolves and geese don't compete at all. They're not fighting each other for food. They're not fighting for space. They're not fighting for resources. It's always within your own population that you have your greatest competition. Now, species that are similar to you, that have maybe an overlapping ecological niche. There's some similarities. You share the same general habitat. You need some of the same food. Then you're going to have competition. So what we can see happening, what sometimes will occur, in order to decrease competition, different populations, different species will do a thing called niche partitioning. This is when they share the resources. Okay, so instead of I'm going to fight all these other birds and I'm going to keep the tree all to myself, these birds share it. So this generally will occur, this is going to happen when resources are plentiful. So there's a big giant pine tree in your backyard, and you may see 5 different species of birds all sharing the same tree. They're all working together, they're all living in the tree, and they're not fighting each other. Instead, they partition it out. They say, okay, I'll take the top. So the Cape May warbler here, it's going to primarily focus on the top of the tree for its nesting site or its feeding area. The black-throated green warbler, that guy is going to go a little bit lower where it feeds. The yellow-rumped warbler, you look at that bird, and that's even lower in the tree and towards the middle. The bay-breasted, you look at its particular area. And then the Blackburnian, that bird's going to feed just on the very top and the outer tips of the tree, or nest up in those regions. So what they're trying to do is minimize the amount of fighting they have to do in order for all 5 of them to live there. Now the pro is, hey, you decrease fighting. You don't have that stress. You don't have that worry. You don't have that risk. You also have a place to feed or have a place to live. You also decrease the potential for being killed when the predator comes around. So if the hawk or the cat or the whatever comes to this tree to kill a bird, and there's 5 of you there, 1 out of 5. If you're the only bird in the tree, you're going to die. So partitioning, niche partitioning is a great way, again, to minimize risk, decrease competition when you have a lot of resources. Now, the negative of it, though, is you don't get as much food. You don't have as much space. And you might actually attract a predator because there's 5 of you, and the predator is more likely to come to a tree with a group of 5 versus just 1. So all species kind of balance this juggle out. They have to balance this out, and things can change. As resources change, so will what these species do. They may niche partition one season, and then the next season, one of those birds may say, nope, tree's all mine, because there's not much food there. Right? So what we're going to look at are different relationships that exist within the community. Every community, there's a variety of different relationships and interactions that are always going to be present. One of those absolutely guaranteed community relationships or interactions is a predator-prey relationship. And what we will see is the predator population will fluctuate with the prey population and vice versa. So the example here, Canadian lynx and snowshoe hares. Okay? So what these guys are going to do is their populations will oscillate in response to each other. All right, so this is actual data. Snowshoe hares, Canadian lynx. The data actually has been tracked all the way up until the 1990s. But what we're looking at is the hare, which is the prey species. It's a rabbit type of creature, is the blue line in the graph. The lynx, which is a predator species, is the red line. So in Illinois, we would look at this as rabbits and maybe bobcats. So as the prey population goes up, there's more food available for the predator. Great, lynxes are excited. More food means we can have more babies and our babies will survive. Our population is going to go up. Now as the predator population goes up, this puts pressure on the prey and causes the prey population to start to decline. So now there's less available prey because you're killing them all. That means the predator population will decline. And this is over generations. This is not in a single day or a single week. This is over generations. Each generation, more babies are born if there's less predation. If there's more food available, more lynx are born, and this kind of oscillation continues to occur over time. In the next lecture, we'll continue talking about predator-prey populations and the variables that also influence them.